welcome to this explainer. Today we are going to unravel an epic 600-year tragedy. We're looking at the dramatic rise and the sudden, violent collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this isn't just a simple sequence of dates on a page or a list of ancient battles. This is the awe-inspiring, almost unbelievable story of a small, obscure frontier tribe that managed to conquer the absolute center of the world, only to systematically and tragically dismantle itself from the inside out. So we have to start with the ultimate question. How does a 600-year-old superpower just vanish? Think about the sheer scale of that. How does an empire that shaped the destiny of millions across 3 different continents simply cease to exist? We're talking about a dynasty that held the spiritual title of the Caliphate, a state that fielded armies that made the monarchs of Europe literally tremble in their castles. How does a force that powerful eventually succumb to internal decay and a completely new world order? To truly understand this, we have to look past the surface. We need to uncover not just what happened, but exactly why it happened. We're going to explore the shifting geopolitical landscapes, the deep psychological traumas of its most elite soldiers, and the catastrophic shifts in thinking that defined its final, desperate days. If we look at this timeline, you can clearly see the explosive, almost unprecedented scale of their expansion. In the year 1300, Osman I founded a very small Turkish Muslim principality, and from that exact moment, the momentum was practically unstoppable. They went from a tiny frontier state to dictating global politics in just a few generations. By 1345, they launched their very first invasion into Europe through the Balkans, and then came 1453. Mehmed the Conqueror captured the impregnable city of Constantinople, decisively and permanently ending the ancient Byzantine Empire. It was a massive shockwave across the globe. By the time Suleiman the Magnificent took the throne in 1520, the Ottomans weren't merely participating in global politics anymore. They were entirely dictating them. Chapter 1: Forging a Global Empire. Let's step back and explore the strategic brilliance that allowed this unprecedented military and political machine to emerge in the first place. Driven by absolute, ironclad discipline, these early Ottomans completely reordered the balance of power in Europe and the Middle East. And they inspired such profound terror that European mothers would actually frighten their children into obedience with tales of the approaching Ottoman armies. But, and this is a crucial point, they didn't just conquer territory with brute force. They integrated it. They absorbed brilliant minds from across their conquered lands, leading to massive medical and scientific innovations. By the time of Sultan Selim I, they had pushed deep into the Middle East, officially assuming the title of Caliph. The empire was no longer just a kingdom. It was now the recognized supreme protector of the entire global Muslim community. Chapter 2: Suleiman's Golden Age. When we examine the absolute peak of Ottoman power in the 16th century, there is an incredibly fascinating detail that often gets overlooked. While the terrified powers of Europe dubbed Suleiman the Magnificent due to his overwhelming wealth and his devastating military might, his own subjects respectfully called him something else entirely. To them, he was the lawgiver. You see, Suleiman wasn't just a ruthless conqueror. He undertook the monumental, incredibly complex task of revolutionizing the empire's entire judicial system. He harmonized secular, sultanic law with Islamic Sharia law, successfully building the intricate structural foundations that allowed a massively diverse, multi-ethnic empire to actually function and thrive. So their true superpower wasn't just deployed on the battlefield. It was rooted in a deeply organized, state-sponsored cultural golden age. Suleiman heavily patronized artistic societies known as the El-e-Hiref, brilliantly blending Arabic, Turkish, and European artistic cultures into something completely new and uniquely Ottoman. You had master architects, like the legendary Mimar Sinan, designing over 300 stunning buildings. These weren't just functional structures, they were immense stone domes and towering minarets designed to project absolute sovereign power. And out on the seas, the Ottoman fleet essentially turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake, driving a massively interconnected global economy that funneled unimaginable wealth right back to Istanbul. Chapter 3: The Janissary Paradox. But history tells us that every great empire harbors a fatal internal flaw. And for the Ottomans, that flaw was buried deep within the psychology of their most elite military defenders, the Janissaries. This is where the story takes a rather dark psychological turn. Imagine, for a moment, being forcibly deracinated from your family at a very young age. You are taken to a foreign land, converted to a completely new religion, and subjected to the most brutal, unyielding military discipline imaginable. This was the Devshirme system. It intentionally stripped these young Christian boys of their genealogical and cultural ties. Why? So that they would owe their entire existence, their absolute loyalty, solely to the Sultan. And as a horrifying psychological climax to this training, these men were often required to march back and fight the very communities they originally came from. Now, initially, this intense shared trauma forged what was called the Ojak spirit. It created a fearless, unbreakable brotherhood of highly disciplined warriors who were essentially the special forces of their day. But as the centuries passed and the empire evolved, a rot set in. These once invincible warriors essentially transformed into a deeply entrenched, heavily armed mafia. They infiltrated the commercial guilds of Istanbul, and their brotherhood fractured into what was known as the company spirit. Rival janissary companies began running violent extortion rackets over turf in districts like Galata. They used their absolute military immunity to literally hold the capital city hostage. They would frequently revolt, set fires to the city, and even violently dethrone and execute sultans who dared to threaten their profits. Chapter 4. The Tides of Decline. Those internal cracks in their armor soon became glaringly visible on the global stage. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was an apocalyptic shock to the Ottoman system. Picture the sky turning black, filled with thick smoke and deafening cannon fire, as the Holy League, a massive coalition of Catholic states, completely decimated the supposedly invincible Ottoman fleet. For Europe, this was a legendary, miraculous victory. But for the Ottomans, it was a devastating psychological blow that suddenly and violently shattered their long-held aura of complete invincibility in the Mediterranean. But did the imperial court acknowledge this massive crisis? Not at all. Instead of facing reality, Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha arrogantly boasted to the Venetians, saying, "We could cast the anchors of the fleet from silver, with ropes braided of silk thread and sails made of satin." Listen to the sheer arrogance of that statement. And remarkably, they actually did manage to rebuild a massive fleet of 230 galleys in less than a single year. But this spectacular cinematic show of wealth was merely masking a brutal reality check. The immense, long-term economic burden of constant global warfare was quietly beginning to break the financial back of the entire empire. Chapter 5. Sick Man of Europe. By the time we reached the 19th century, Suleiman's golden age was nothing more than a distant, fading memory. Centuries of systemic decay and administrative corruption earned the once terrifying empire a humiliating new global title, the Sick Man of Europe. Poor tax collection, hopelessly outdated military technology, and a crippling, desperate dependence on European finance slowly bled the mighty state dry. The military simply could no longer keep pace with the rapid, industrialized advancements of European armies. In reality, they weren't surviving on their own strength anymore. They were surviving primarily because the major European powers simply couldn't agree on how to carve up the massive Ottoman territory without starting a world war amongst themselves. And this desperate struggle for survival created what historians call the Hamidian paradox. It is a brilliant, yet incredibly tragic irony. Look at this breakdown. To save his autocracy, Sultan Abdelhamid II championed traditional pan-Islamism on a global scale. He funded railways to Mecca and actively tried to unite the global Muslim Ummah under traditional madrasa teachings, which viewed the state as the divine protector of the faith. But domestically, to ensure the state's military survival against encroaching European empires, he had no choice but to establish modern secular military academies, known as the Harbiya. These new schools taught European positivism and secular law, viewing the state simply as a sovereign engine of survival. Ultimately, the Sultan's own modern military schools accidentally created a generation of secular officers who viewed the traditional religious establishment as the very root cause of their empire's backwardness. Chapter 6. Fall of the Caliphate. The final, crushing climax of this 600-year story came through a toxic combination of global warfare and a highly surgical, internal political revolution. In 1914, the Ottomans made the fatal decision to ally with Germany in World War I. Fearing a massive global Islamic uprising, British intelligence aggressively funded the Arab Revolt, which fundamentally fractured any remaining illusions of pan-Islamic unity. Then, Britain and France signed the secret, backroom Sykes-Picot Agreement to literally carve up the Middle East between themselves. By 1920, a completely subservient, defeated Istanbul government signed the catastrophic Treaty of Sèvres. They effectively traded away the total sovereignty of the empire just to preserve their own figurehead throne under foreign military occupation. The human tragedy of this era is profound, and it was marked by massive ideological compromises. Out in the burning desert, you had traditional heroes like Fakhruddin Pasha, known as the Tiger of the Desert. He defiantly maintained a starving, desperate, and completely unauthorized 72-day siege to protect the Prophet's tomb in Medina, absolutely horrified by the government's surrender in his temple. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the traditional religious scholars, the ulama, completely misunderstood the totalizing, all-consuming nature of the modern nation-state. Desperate to fight off foreign occupation, they issued religious edicts to legitimize the rising secular military officers. By doing this, they accidentally signed away their own existence. They completely failed to see that these officers fully intended to permanently dismantle the entire Islamic State structure once the war was won. And that brings us to the architect of the end, Mustafa Kemal. He pragmatically and brilliantly used that granted religious legitimacy to mobilize the pious masses during the Turkish War of Independence. But the very moment military victory was secured against the occupying Greek forces, the mask came off. The execution was swift and ruthless. In 1922, they abolished the temporal sultanate. And then, on March 3, 1924, they struck the final lethal blow. They swiftly abolished the spiritual caliphate entirely. They closed the centuries-old religious schools, and within 48 hours, they forced the very last caliph and his entire 600-year-old dynasty onto trains in the dead of night, exiling them from their homeland forever. Just like that, 6 centuries of power gone. The fall of the Ottoman Empire wasn't just about borders changing on a map. It was an occupation of the mind. The abrupt, incredibly violent transition from a deeply traditional religious empire to a fiercely modern secular nation-state left a massive, aching ideological vacuum. Today, when you look at the political polarization in modern Turkey, or the constantly shifting cultural identities and conflicts across the Middle East and beyond, you are looking at the ghost of the caliphate. The unresolved trauma and the massive cultural shockwaves of 1924 continue to actively shape the geopolitical reality of our modern world. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into history. Keep exploring, keep questioning the narratives, and I'll see you in the next explainer.